Anyone who has any form of creative passion is familiar with the term writer's block. We've all felt those moments where we just get stuck, and try as we may, we can't seem to get unstuck. And that was very much what it was like for me to write this sermon this week. You see, this was not the first sermon I wrote this week. I wrote another one before this. I looked at the passages this week and I was just lost. And not only was I lost, I was uninspired, and frankly, the one through line I did see, I felt like I was in no place to write about. Because the only through line I could find in these passages this week was mercy. And when I saw that, I felt like God was playing a joke on me specifically. Because I have not felt particularly merciful this week. I've been facing harassment for being a queer minister, and it's been exhausting. The news broke that Carolyn Bryant, the woman whose lies got a young black boy named Emmett Till, died, and even though she was dead, she spent her life without consequences and lived to the ripe old age of 88, when Emmett Till got only 14 years of life. I went to the grocery store the other day, and the aisle with the baby formula has a camera to keep desperate mothers from stealing food for their children, but investment bankers who gamble with the economy and cause poverty to get bailed out whenever they mess up. Every day, there is a new news story about someone innocent being killed or someone terrible getting off the hook. It always feels like mercy is granted to the wrong people. So I wrote what I could, but every time I looked at it, I hated it. And I kept asking the Lord for help, but she was silent. Then on Wednesday at 1 a.m., God finally answered. When you're a minister, you start to realize you are no longer working on your time, you are working on God's. And God is very much the drag queen whose music is playing, and she shows up half-dressed with a Starbucks latte in hand, like, sorry I'm late, got stuck in traffic. And I sat there and I listened, and she said, you silly man. The point is not just the mercy. That's part of it, but the through line is not mercy. It's the stone. I'm often criticized for being a queer minister. A lot of other Christians really dislike me because they see me as sinful. They've cast me in a role, and I have refused to play it. People like you are not fit to be a preacher, they say. Queer people are abominations. Go be a sex worker or a drug dealer, or better yet, just be rid of yourself. And it's not just me they say this to. It's every queer person who dares to step outside the roles they have decided we should play. A lot of queer people also dislike that I am a queer minister. They say, how dare you still believe in this? Don't you know what Christians do to us? What they have done to us? Look at all the harm this religion has caused, the crusades, the boarding schools. The Bible has been used to justify some of the greatest atrocities mankind has ever seen. But my friends, the Word of God is like a stone, and a stone is neutral. It cannot feel on its own. It does not make decisions. It's only when you put it in the hands of people that it has any power at all. In the stoning of Stephen, we see that religious dogma can be used to kill, to hurt others. And Christianity is the majority religious dogma of America today. And as much as we don't like to admit it, Christianity is as capable of extremism as any other religion. Stephen was an innocent man. He did not deserve his treatment, but those around him perceived a sin in him, so they took those stones in their hands and they murdered him. In vicious hands, the Bible becomes a weapon. It is used indiscriminately to bludgeon anyone that the majority sees fit. During chattel slavery, Christians cherry-picked the parts of the Bible where slavery was mentioned to justify and condone that evil practice. My great-grandmother was the victim of an indigenous residential school started by the Catholic Church. Children were beaten, tortured, and killed in those schools, their bodies stacked in mass graves, and the church backed those practices up. It was not until 2009 that the Pope even expressed his sorrow for that loss of life and culture. In Weimar, Germany, many churches displayed Nazi imagery inside their churches. They used the Bible to back up their anti-Semitism. The preachers pointed to the Passion and that said, the Jews killed Jesus, they need to be eradicated. And now, in our present day, Christian nationalists hold up the Bible and say it is God's will that we eradicate transgenderism from public life. But a bludgeon, for those the majority believes to be sinners, is not the only use for the stone. In 1 Samuel 7, we see the stone being used for another purpose. We see the stone being put in David's slingshot and hurled towards Goliath. This small young man used a stone to defeat a giant. And we too can use this stone to fight back against enemies who seem far too big for us to handle. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. used his love of God during the civil rights movement as a tool of civil disobedience, malicious compliance, and righteous justice. Reverend Fred Rogers used what he had found in the Bible to testify before a skeptical Congress to secure funding for educational public television for children. And a literal stone, or brick, was used to start the Stonewall riots in 1969, leading to incredible advances in queer rights. In 1 Peter 2, verses 2 through 10, we see Christ being used as a cornerstone to build strong foundations, to create solid, lasting change. We see these cornerstones when Christians build strong, kind churches to be used as third spaces and houses of worship. We see them when hospitals and homeless shelters are built. We see those stones building flood walls in places in need of disaster relief. And anywhere those things are being built, no matter what race, religion, sexuality, or gender the people building them are, the love of Christ is there. But in John 8, verses 1 through 11, we see what happens when the stone is dropped altogether. It states Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." The stone here is a symbol of mercy. I know it may be hard to imagine since I'm standing at the pulpit. I think it's sometimes hard to see ministers as full people with lives and pasts, but this path was not one I ever thought I'd be on. About 8 years ago, I was homeless, traveling, deep in addiction. And at that time, I would lie, cheat, and steal to get what I needed. I was a sex worker and a criminal, and I cared very little how my actions affected others because I wanted to survive, and I was going to do whatever I had to do that. And I was hitchhiking through Texas up the Highway 45 with nothing but a pack and a dear friend. A route I had chosen because my biological father had promised me a ride that never came. And along that highway, my friend died from his addiction. He had a withdrawal seizure, and his head struck the stone pavement, and he was gone, and I just left. I just started walking because all I knew how to do was survive. I was going to survive, come hell or high water. And for 2 days, I walked up that highway, barely stopping for rest or food or drink, until I ended up in a little town called Huntsville. And this little town was well known for its big prison and its corrupt police force. But my legs felt like they couldn't walk another step, so I sat down by the off-ramp with a cardboard sign that said Denver in Sharpie. I had some friends in Denver, and I was hoping they could put me up for a few days before I continued aimlessly wandering once again. And as I sat on that on-ramp, an officer approached me. He rolled down his window and shouted, "You! If I see you here again, you're going to do 90 days for solicitation." And not wanting to make waves, I said, "That's fine, sir. I'll just go make camp." The officer replied, "If I see you make camp, you'll do 90 days for vagrancy." So I picked up my pack and started walking again, this time through the town. And the officer followed close behind me. I could feel my face getting hot and red with fury, and in that moment, I ran. He sped up, but I ran and I lost him down an alley. And by that alley were some bushes, and without even unpacking my blankets, I lay down in those bushes and fell asleep. The next morning I awoke, covered in cold dew, and a man's voice said, "It's Easter morning. Would you like something to eat?" I saw a hand outstretched in front of me, and a man's face came into focus. It was a minister. And he took me in and warmed my bones and fed me and bought me a bus ticket all the way to Denver. The cars along the highway granted me no mercy. The officer in that town granted me no mercy. And I'm not sure in that moment I even deserved mercy. But that minister gave it to me anyway. And when we look at the story of the adulterous woman, Jesus said to her, "Go forth and sin no more." But I had no intention of doing that. Even though I had been fed and clothed and granted that mercy, my goal was to survive. And maybe the adulterous woman had no intention of doing that either. Maybe she went right back out and cheated on her husband again. But that's not really the point, is it? The point was not what the woman did, because the story is not about her sin. It is about Jesus' mercy. Whether she continued to sin is irrelevant. The mercy, that is the message. So the next time we find ourselves with a stone in our hands, ready to cast it at those we deem unworthy, perhaps we need to ask ourselves if that stone can be better used elsewhere. Maybe we can use that stone to fight for our liberation from oppressive systems. Maybe we can use that stone to build a wall around a garden. Maybe we can climb on top of that stone and lift ourselves out of a dark pit. Or we can drop the stone altogether and use that free hand to reach out to someone in need. The stone is yours. The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Amen.